好，那我介绍下一位讲者哈，讲者是 Tania Roy 啊，他是目前是那个国立新加坡啊，好像有很多那个李明老师的粉丝啊走了，他国立新加坡大学英国语言学系的教授啊。那他目前他专门研究的领域是法兰克福学派批判理论的一个理论跟后殖民研究哈，以及这个世界文学中外围政治现实主义跟印度当代艺术。那么他今天所要讲的是有关于地景的消失的地景啊，那围绕了一个非常重要的一个印度当代艺术的一个对于有关于领土暴力生态暴力生态的一些相关的议题。那我们现在欢迎Tania Roy 的一个演讲，谢谢。
Good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank the curators, Professor Mali Wu and Mr. Francesco Manacorda for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I'd also like to thank the director, Mr. Lim Ping, for hosting this conversation here today in the museum. And especially to all of you for coming out today for the conversation. I look forward to it. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a citation that's on the board there from the very famous photojournalist Henri Cartier-Bresson. And he says, sometime in the 1930s, the world is going to pieces and people like the photographers Ansel Adams and Edward Weston are photographing rocks. The response by Ansel Adams is also quite interesting for our conversation today. Insofar as Henri Cartier-Bresson makes this protest in the midst of America's Great Depression in the 1930s, the exchange becomes instructive for what I will have to say further on along in the line of this conversation. The comment famously outlines Cartier-Bresson's positioning as a photographic witness to something like a modern century, first through chronicling the economic hardships of everyday life across the European continent in the early 20th century that would, in a few short years, pave the way for World War. Then, after the war, he would make a body of work that links the awakening of the decolonizing nation through photographs of the funeral of Mahatma Gandhi after Gandhi's assassination in 1948, to revolution and the last stages of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Now, while this is a somewhat misplaced beginning for the topic of my talk today, I want to take my cue here. I'm sorry why this slide is. I would like to take my cue here from Cartier-Bresson's complaint, as also from Adams' less cited response to it, as a line of contestation or a quarrel that is unsettling in its immediate implications for our contemporary concerns. And these concerns I will call anthropogenic, a term that suggests that nature, as a certain kind of invention or idea, has passed, and along with the passing of nature, something like the periodizing categories of the previous century of World War, decolonization, and revolution as the historical underpinnings of massive forced migrations of populations across national borders and the geographies of the Cold War have also passed for us. So along with the idea of nature, something like the periods by which we narrated history have also disintegrated. So with the turn of the millennium, chronology, or history as the horizon of possibility for human action, loses explanatory force. And also in the process of disintegration is something like that philosophical subject that we call ontology. Ontology, or the ability to make an absolute distinction between the distinctions that mark out species of life and the category of non-life. So ontology as that absolute distinction between life and non-life. And that distinction underpins the origins of Western European thought. You can think of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant's separation of human and natural history in his essay, What is Enlightenment, from 1755. That's a very interesting essay also because it was the year of the Great Lisbon earthquake, a terrible earthquake that destroyed the city of Lisbon, which at the time was like an entry point for the old world into the new world. So with the destruction of Lisbon is also the moment in which Immanuel Kant separates for Western thought the categories of natural and human history. So I'm trying to situate the notion of the anthropogenic and this question of the rock within this kind of broader historical understanding. We also should mention the decade-long history of the Taipei Biennale, and within such a conjuncture, this year's curatorial statement, which invites us to turn our look from the human to ecological systems of interdependency, as to metabolic formations of reciprocity and adaptation. And as such, I think we are being cued to something like a geological epoch, one that we have come to associate with the Anthropocene. Now, I know the Anthropocene is not the main subject of the display or really even of the topic today, but I do feel like it's presupposed in much of the works that are exhibited in the Biennale, and so I'll just say a few words about it before turning to the direct subject of my talk today. So since Paul Crutzen, the atmospheric chemist, gave popular currency to the term, the anthropogenic has come to stand for an era when the forces of human existence began to eclipse all other biological, geological, and meteorological phenomena, thus displacing the most recent era of evolutionary change, the Holocene. In other words, the Anthropocene marks human activity as a determinative mode of planetary existence, and it's a toxic mode of existence at that. As an idea, the Anthropocene suggests that it outstrips the proposition that humans merely modify a given environment through action. Right? Because in the age of the Anthropocene, we see how human activities have a totalizing impact on the planet and on planetary change. Now, while some have backdated the beginnings of this geological period to the invention of agriculture and the population explosion of the Neolithic era, others cite the detonation of the atom bomb that released radionuclide sediments into the stratosphere or the air itself, which, like the first use of chemical warfare in the trenches of Ypres in World War I, toxifies by corroding the very distinction between environment and self, as indeed of figures such as the state combatant and an external enemy. Because when you inhale the poison gas, the same gas that is meant to kill your enemy, you are also consuming that toxin into your very biology. And so there's a way in which this figure, in some ways the figure, the trope really of toxicity is an interesting one because it also destroys distinctions, political distinctions between inside and outside, self and enemy. With satellite technology and its connection to the intimate sphere of the family through television in the 1960s, this idea would be consolidated as the whole Earth, a blue planet that could be destroyed by the same human intention that visualized it, that is, from the insensible cold and darkness of outer space as a total picture. However narrated, this golden spike, as it's called, of anthropogenic activity, or the chemical signature of planetary change left in rock formations, ancient ice, or sediments of the floor, is inseparable from the extensive history of coal use in modern Europe, which expanded exponentially through the mining of the northern English coalfields through the 18th century. Recently, Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin have returned that history of industrialization to just about a century after Columbus's voyage to the Americas to 1610, finding evidence of massive transactions between species from the old and new worlds, together with geological evidence of an earth-changing drop in carbon dioxide levels, which were attributed to the mass extinction of 50 million inhabitants of the Americas through epidemic. So this kind of geological evidence of extermination is really a thesis on the global mixing of populations and species, and this is why Lewis and Maslin call this an orbis spike. Orbis is the Latin word for world. There's a way in which this hypothesis is quite interesting for us because it signals the dual origins of oceanic trade and colonization as the ignition key for early industrial capitalism in England and the continent. That is, for penetration and consumption of the deep earth, which set off incalculable tons of hydrocarbons into the atmosphere. Inseparable from the early modern histories of imperial conquest and territorial annexation, the modern carbon bomb puts in motion the revolutionary speed of climate change today, and perhaps what we apprehend from our various disciplinary positions, the onset of what some have called the sixth great extinction. Now, nearly a century old, this argument between Cartier-Bresson and Ansel Adams about the vocation of photography as a properly modern art strikes us as dated in this context. And this, together with the Anthropocene, is not, of course, the immediate discussion that we have before us today. But the argument does acquire a very unsettling or uncanny significance for us by reanimating the question of sovereignty, or the scope and extent of human formations of power as we find them within this current discourse of the anthropogenic. So I'm going to say a little bit about this notion of sovereignty and power before I turn to the artworks that I want to discuss. Sovereign power, following Michel Foucault, is the right to make live and let die. In the first pages of Discipline and Punish, published in 1975, Foucault reminds us of the age of European kings. The right to kill, to subtract life from bodies, also included the regal performance of generosity, of letting live. If sovereign power is associated with the center of power, the king or the court, or perhaps even the notion of a sovereign people as constituted by a modern republic, the power to let live or let die begins to radiate outwards from a political center, Foucault tells us, coming to constitute something like a global regime of power by the 1970s. In his lectures at the Collège de France from 1976 to 1977, which are entitled Society Must Be Defended, Security, Territory, Population, Foucault identifies this shift through a notion called biopower. Between the late 19th century into the 20th, as the fundamental biological elements of the human species became the object of political power, and more, as what Foucault identifies as, quote, a general strategy of power, something changes in the nature of sovereign power. So we can think then of how states manage bodies and populations through a set of technologies and knowledge forms related, for example, to public health, the management and distribution of reproductive rights by the state, housing or population settlement policies, and the statistical and taxonomic tools of the land survey or the census. As such, we might approach the question about biopolitics today as located between two facets of power. In one dimension, as those tactics and set of controls associated with governmentality and the modern state. In its other current dimension, as extending further into the entanglement of life, bios, non-life, geos, as it currently plays out in what Elizabeth Povinelli calls the late liberal governance of difference and markets. So to return to the figure of the rock as posed by Cartier-Bresson, it is of course raised in the quotation as an example of unsuitable material for artistic attention, but it is interesting for anticipating a situation that we might identify through the itinerary of this year's Biennale as becoming geological. So we have on the one side of this early 20th century exchange the precarious holding together of the world of man as articulated by Ansel Adams in a kind of emotional ecology between the animate and the inanimate, and on the other, the falling apart of that vitalist understanding of the world into something like a uniform earth, one that is a world that is going to pieces as the literal sediment of human activity. This is a quotation by the post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakravarti, which I will keep on the board for you to look at. It will give you a sense of what, in a way, is already at contention in the citation that I had up earlier. So we see contending figures, in other words, of artistic perception, practice, and display as already encountering something like the anthropogenic. Now, let me just move to this citation and highlight a few things from it. There's a way in which Dipesh Chakravarti, who has, for the last several years, started writing about the question of history and of ethics in the age of the Anthropocene, that is quite interesting. It's a sort of hesitation in Chakrabarti's work to give up entirely on the figure of the human. And so what he does in this passage is he wants to retrieve what he calls the figure of the homo, and he wants to read that figure into the anthropos. And in so doing, Dipesh Chakravarti wants to open up a space between the lines of two properly unknowable events. One, irreversible climate change accelerated by the resource wars of the Anthropocene. The other, on the other side, a historical horizon hitherto ordered through the count of human chronology that stands on the verge of disappearance. Disappearance, however, not into the drama of finitude and mortality, of life and death that begins, that stands at the origin of the European Enlightenment, but in a form of death that begins and ends in non-life, in the mass extinction of humans, biological life, and as we are so frequently reminded, the planet itself. And such a situation has been described by some commentators as entropic, as a kind of pull of matter backwards in time. Why entropic? Because in this view, we are returned to a time before death, that is to say, a time before the life and death of individuals and species, into what Pavanelli calls a time of the geos, of soullessness. Now this situation entails first the task of making available to human experience a series of cascading, contained crises, such that the very figure of the human, together with the anthropocentric account of historical time, can no longer constitute a singular or operative agency. But this is also to claim that our psychological faculties, in some sense, right, our psychological faculties, insofar as they're also formed by technology, cannot properly know or even simply endure the aggregated effects of human action on the world. So put another way, we might say that if the emergence of an anthropogenic awareness originates in the natural sciences, it has found accelerated, even urgent circulation across the arts and the humanities, especially perhaps within an Anglo-American university context as a catalyzing idea. So the term continues to proliferate through academic disciplines, even as I think it indexes a certain ambivalence or doubt around its very currency, its purchase today. And I think this has to do with the sense that we can no longer really ensure the ability to care across intergenerational divides. So we can generate all these vocabularies, but I think that the proliferation of these vocabularies speaks to an anxiety that our capacities for human care in some way have become endangered. There is a question of a kind of intergenerational conception of care, and that if we assume that climate crisis positions us now astride the scales of human and inhuman time, as Chakravarti does, we are compelled to ask over how many generations are we capable of caring. This is to say then the question of the Anthropogene is one of responsibility. If, as Chakravarti says, it is a moral and not causal proposition, then we also have to concede that our faculties for caring have become ungrounded from the perceptual as well as historical orientations of the last century, as from its associated politics. So while our ability to care might have evolved over millennia, we realize today that it's not unlimited. I think there's also a way in which Chakravarti is reminding us implicitly against the kind of secret or furtive return of a sort of universalism as the political limit of the Anthropocene, which is the master figure of a critical discourse that has pervaded the humanities and the arts, according to which the human, reconceived now as anthropos, acquires an agency that is geological in scale. So this is quite apocalyptic. I mean, there's something quite cataclysmic about this way of thinking, which I also think is rather suggestive for us. It is a new historical imaginary where something like apocalypse is established not really as a kind of fanaticism, but rather as what the media theorist Bernard Stiegler calls an order of disinvestment. And we can come back to that idea if you'd like. I think it's quite an interesting idea that has economic overtones of disinvestment of a capitalist system that plays short-termism against long-term investments, but also, of course, the psychological category of not caring very much, of disinvestment. Okay, so from this place, I want to now go backwards really, to a sort of, and suggest somewhat tentatively a kind of art historical origin for the artworks out of a contemporary context in India that I want to look at today. And I want to call it, I want to say that we're looking back in a way at a figure of the human which takes its form in a 20th century tradition of art in India, which we might want to identify as disaster art. So many of you will recognize Raghu Rai's awful iconic image of what has come to be known as the Bhopal gas tragedy from 1984, which was 2 years before Chernobyl and more than a quarter of a century before Fukushima, as also of its continuing aftermath, which Rai returned to document over the course of the next 17 years. The multinational Union Carbide Corporation's pesticide formulation factory in Bhopal leaked 40 tons of the lethal methyloisocyanide chemical, MIC, and it is estimated that more than 20,000 persons died as a direct result. We also know that it rained over the city of Bhopal in central India on the night of December 2nd, 1984, compounding and diffusing the effects of the leak into the soil and atmosphere, and that an estimated 8,000 people died within the first 3 days. A population of nearly 500,000 was severely affected. More than 50,000 survivors were disabled for life, and a generation after the disaster, children are born with severe chromosomal defects. In the absence of knowledge regarding the name and nature of the poison, as well as its antidote, residents of Bhopal were said to have run over the course of the first night, vomiting and collapsing in the darkness. So it's an event of mass terror, and its visualization appears inseparable from popular narratives of a long dark night of 3 days, related in contemporary journalistic accounts as the order of both psychological and genocidal oblivion. And so as one journalist writes, the accident transformed the city of Bhopal into a gas chamber. It's a rhetorical point, no doubt, but it is intended to inform a national readership of the indigenization of Europe's extermination camp into state structures through which India's urban poor are today governed. 3 decades later, judicial hearings, bureaucratic involvement, and the civil society have failed to formulate an adequate response, and Union Carbide has paid an average compensation of $500 each for each victim, and not a single individual has been held criminally responsible. Now I want to suggest that something quite interesting is happening here visually, something of a cataclysmic imagery and a very ocular-centric, eye-centric spectacle of disaster does historically frame the population of India's poor, and it lodges itself in national memory through Rai's photograph. Rai, I think, is also he's framing for you the post-independent history of industrial development in India, together, I propose, with an attendant art historical inheritance of a 20th century tradition of photojournalism, and he's framing both these things together into a fossilized or petrified scene of groundbreaking. So it is perhaps the obsoleted, outmoded figure of the sovereign nation, once understood as an historical opening for decolonizing societies into the 20th century, which is reduced here to the fossilized eyes and partially excavated features of the child. So Rai's portrait then accounts in granular mode not only for those populations that are condemned historically to something like the status of the living dead, but also from their symbolic disappearance from India's current neoliberal imaginary. So aside from the photograph, the viewer has no clarity as to whether she witnesses a burial or an exhumation. There's a second, more unsettling possibility, insofar as this photograph returns us to the figure of the rock and the movement of becoming geological, with which I began the talk. And this is to say that the fabric of artistic technologies, in this instance photography, continues to link the political history of sovereignty and of exception from rules of sovereignty and citizenship in post-independent India to global genealogies of what is displayed in this photograph, quite literally as the extraction and production of the materiality of life under conditions of advancing capitalism. I want to go back to, even further back, to an image from 1944 from the photographer Sunil Jana, who was born in 1918, died in 2012. He's a photographer of national and international renown in his time. His career spanned the interwar years into the first decade of market liberalization in India. He was a leading member of the Communist Party of India. And Jana's work with landscape spanned a range of photographic subjects over his very long life. They included industrial photography in the era of Nehruvian industrialization. And after his expulsion from the CPI, from the Communist Party, he took a very lyrical, perhaps nostalgic series of ethnographic photographs of the Chantal indigenous peoples in the east of India. But his oeuvre is most closely associated with his shattering photo documentary of the so-called Bengal famine of 1943. Let me give you a bit of background about this event. There are no conclusive estimates of the fatalities of the famine, but the numbers that we have tell us that the disaster claimed the lives of between 3 and 5 million people, and even that discrepancy, right, of 2 million people is very disturbing. But between 3 and 5 million people in the course of a little over a year. The famine also impoverished pre-independent ecologies that linked the coastal geography of Bengal across its fertile flatlands to semi-feudal practices of agricultural labor and indigenous artisanal skill. The causes of the famine were complex, although it has been studied by Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen as one of the great forgotten disasters of the Second World War, and more specifically for this economist, as a kind of exemplary account of man-made or perhaps even politically manufactured natural disaster. The overlapping causes were related to an order of politics that we might identify with a state of emergency, that is, with strategic wartime exploitation of the colony, in which state guaranteed laws to food reserves were suspended in order to divert rice supplies to British troops serving on the Eastern Front. The decision led to escalating inflation across the region of Bengal and levels of privation, of hardship, that had been unprecedented. Now, what's quite interesting is the way that Prime Minister Winston Churchill thought about this event. Emilia Terracciano, an art historian of modernist art in India, reminds us that in his autobiography from 1953, Churchill said that, these are his words, no great portion of the world population had been, quote, so effectively protected from the horrors of World War as India, a population that, on his view, had been, quote, carried on the shoulders of this small island, Britain. In fact, Churchill would choose to redirect food supplies from the Atlantic towards, that were going from the Atlantic to Bengal, to Greece. By 1943, Greece had been occupied by the Nazis and its population was facing starvation. So this is then to say that Churchill associated something like sacrifice, a long overdue sacrifice of the colony to the imperial nation of Britain, with the racial difference of the Bengali rural worker and her social geography. So race becomes an operative marker of those bodies or populations that are considered exceptions to the rule of law. In the colonial context, this is the rule that removes the colonial population from rights that are due to what the imperial administrator understands as the properly human. Put in another way, if for Churchill the question of humanity was established through a biopolitical calculus of making live and letting die, life could only be imagined through the extreme possibility of European disaster, European war, and the predicament of starvation that faced the Greek population. In Jana's account of the landscape of famine, the regimen of sovereignty is already established through the emergency of war, where populations are instrumentalized according to a principle of racial exclusion from the norms of citizenship and protection of a juridical order. In Rai, at stake is the very norm of national sovereignty and citizenship, which is invoked only in order to be suspended in the case of populations that are deemed physically displaceable, if not disposable, to the developmental politics of the industrializing nation. And it is for this reason that the post-colonial scholar Achille Mbembe argues that we could propose that it is the colony, or rather the post-colony, that serves as the ideal location for citing not merely the violence of the state of exception to the protection of the law, but its normalization as an everyday management of colonized bodies. The post-colony, then, is what Mbembe calls the zone of a necropolitics, that is the management of death within the order of colonial governmentality. So what I'm trying to say, that if the material destruction of bodies and populations, as indeed of living ecologies of rural work and co-authorization, were first authorized in the service of civilization as defined by empire, this logic is indigenized and repurposed after independence as the governance of national resources and population differences in the current regime of liberal multinational capital. And here is just another image from Jana of the enormous migrations that were caused by the Bengal famine. And I won't spend too much time on this image, but what's interesting about it is that it comes to, these figures come, and the composition of these figures, the use of landscape comes to compose a kind of genre for an order of photography that would, 30 years later, also be used to document the partition of India, and then again the partition of Bengal with the War of Independence in 1971 into Bangladesh. So now let me come to the artist Amar Kanwar, who I want to spend the rest of my time speaking about. And we can think about what happens to landscape in this situation of post-nature through a citation from Kanwar's own writing. He describes the piece that I'm going to talk about in one instance as landscape, quote, just prior to erasure. So the Southern Forest from 2011 by Delhi-based artist Amar Kanwar is an unfolding assemblage comprised of still and moving images, narrative, the recorded voice, sculpture, maps, organic matter of seeds and grain, objects that relate manual work to industry, and the mark of writerly inscription. Installed as an archival exhibit in each of its iterations, this expansive, potentially unfinished project has been shown at Documenta 13 in 2012, the 11th Sharjah Biennale the following year, the Kochi Museus Biennale 2012 and 13, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park the same year, the Edinburgh Art Festival in 2014, and most recently the Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore and the Max Muller Bhavan in Mumbai in 2016. One dimension of the project, Evidence Archive, is called Evidence Archive, remains on permanent display at the campus of the independent media collective Shramadrushti in the city of Bhubaneswar in Odisha. So the solvent forests, that aspect of it, which is a permanent installation in Odisha, together with this ongoing itinerary of movement, finds aesthetic exposition or artistic elaboration with each installation in new contexts. The project continues to aggregate and organize its elements so as to combine the functions of public pedagogy, archive, library, and museum into the singular space of the exhibition. In its constellated use of different media and related genres of presentation, its mobility across transnational sites, and in its open-ended exposition of modern concepts of sovereignty, territory, and political autonomy, the Southern Forest retains, nevertheless, an intensive meditation on place. Now the slide here from a 5-minute long color film, high-definition color film called Love Story, which is part of the installation. You can read Conroy's own note on the side, but what I want to say about this is this lone figure that stands on this expanding, unnatural, anthropogenic hill of waste, as it were, is an interesting figure because he appears to stand in a position where he might be reabsorbed as value into the machine of capital, and waste, or the migrant worker here, who has already been displaced from the category of rural labor, also seems to be nearly inseparable from waste, detritus, and sediment. Anyway, on the matter of place, these works, they detail the landscape, terrain, and communities of rural labor in the state of Odisha in central East India. That's a location map on the left. The smaller map, of course, is the whole of the Indian, that's the map of India, and then you can see the state of Odisha on the east. And the project archives a regional history through the incursion of multinational corporate interests over the past 2 decades by tracing the deregulation of land use in India. In 1993, India opened its economy to multinational capital. And so there's a way in which the historical memory of the piece really goes back to the deregulation of resources and the economy to multinationalism in the mid to late 1990s. The southern forest presupposes the current exhaustion of bauxite supplies. Bauxite is used for aluminium manufacture, and Latin America used to be the primary provider of bauxite. And in this way, the installation stages the forest, this idea of the forest, together with the topographical entity and the social geography of this mineral-rich region as the most recent commodity frontier for global capital. I'll just tell you some things about what makes this area of this quite vast area of land interesting to industrial interests. Odisha holds over 57% of India's bauxite reserves. I've already mentioned to you the significance of bauxite, but it also has nearly 25% of India's manganese reserves, 25% of India's iron ore reserves, which is a figure of huge historical significance for the steelmaking industry, which in India dates back to the 1950s, and nearly the same amount in national coal reserves. And we should remember that India is the 4th largest exporter of coal today. Archiving the impact of intensive industrial mining on the predominantly agricultural communities of this resource-rich state, as also on regional populations that remain part of a shared topography despite federal borders, so continuing into the center of India. The installation unfolds within a historical moment. This is what I would like to suggest, a historical moment marked by the persistence of modernist ideologies of sovereignty, that is to say, state-centered narratives of development and underdevelopment and national advancement, which have nevertheless been reconfigured since the turn of the millennium within what we might call a globalist contract between an entrepreneurial state, multinational capital, and a small clutch of family-owned industrial corporations. So developed over a period of 10 years, the installation narrativizes these histories through the continuing opposition of indigenous and working people. By presenting the topographical terrain that connects Odisha to the neighboring state of Chhattisgarh as continuous, that is to say, across markers of ethnicities and caste identifications that operate as a means of India's electoral apparatus. So Kanwar is, in a way, eliding or somehow going over those ethnic markers that have been mobilized politically. Kanwar is in fact documenting the life worlds of India's most impoverished populations through the outlines of a massive, if largely nationally invisible movement for environmental justice. So as a transient, evolving museological display of both loss and collective resistance, the Southern Forest suggests a disturbing mode of perpetuity. The archive overwhelms because it continues through an aggregation of materials that are as potentially extensive as the penetration of industrial corporate interests into the fossil bed of the landscape. An earth that is extracted and produced is nothing other than the borderless acquisition of capital. It's an order of movement and acceleration that finds its contemporary form in information capital, and which surely undergirds the conditions of possibility for the work's movement. But in its other facet, as duration, of dwelling in the time of something like a testimonial, the sovereign forest distills the experience of human grief or bereavement into indigenous systems of experimentation, cultivation, and taxonomy, which appear within the sight of the artistic display as a kind of truth claim, as a sort of truth claim that can't be disputed, as evidence. So so-called informal knowledges then are offered by the work as an emotional and material complexity that exhausts commodity cycles of industry and market. Such non-commercial knowledges acquire the status of a knowledge claim. They are disavowable in Kanwar's display at least, if not in the political geography that fixes the claim to territory to norms of state sovereignty and citizenship. The nation, in other words, is interrupted through these curated disruptions and the aesthetic construct of the forest. In its immersive artistic appeal, the ensemble might also be approached as an effort in media archaeology, conjuring a multiplicity of perceptual technologies from the book form to the handcraft of its binding, colonial, cartographic, and land surveying modes of visualizing the land and soil, the use of light projection to digital cinematography. The sovereign forest reaggregates these technologies of the visible into a singular space of narration. While eluding comprehensive description, the sovereign forest does, I think, concretize a position within each installation, and it does this through orality, through the voice, through the orality of poetry. The recorded, repeated, and protracted word serves less as a measure of uncountable lost things than as a documentation of the intersecting dimensions and multiple scales of loss itself. Landscape as genre, the political figure of the disappeared activist, and nature itself figure in the inventory of disappeared objects. Disappearance then is mediated through chromatic, high-definition projections in which, as the artist note instructs us, quote, every blade of grass, every water source, every tree that is seen is now meant to not exist anymore, is intended to be looked at through the terrain of conflict, end quote. The terrain of anthropogenic conflict, in other words, that binds personal and ecological loss to the disappearance of cycles of life and death altogether from the land. I'll take these last few minutes to say, to kind of say a few more descriptive things about the piece, and then I will wrap up with a conclusion. So in an important component of the installation, the 42-minute long film, The Scene of a Crime, Kanwal presents 10 maps as a cyclical and sequentially progressive narrative in which images like the digging of sand are related to a judge's refusal to accept evidence of murder. There's a female voice that progresses through an itinerary of increasing displacement, collecting and indeed naming what she calls witnesses. And I will cite from the film. The Vasandhara River, the Niamgari mango sapling, the paddy fields of the Bedal village, the medicinal tree of Kudi Masahi, the betel leaf of the Dinka village, end quote. The installation of poetry as an evidential archive, then, is also an accounting for what Kanwal identifies as conflict, the limit of the law that is also formative of its power, the power to constitute what counts as the subject or citizen of juridical rights, and the suspension of such visibility to figures of exception. So we can talk more about this, but I would like to say that the significance of orality linked to local knowledges are curated in the work less as presences that are held in place by the imagination of something like indigeneity or ethnographic difference, because the cultural imaginary of indigeneity or ethnic racial difference, recall, historically linked the neo-colonial formation of sovereignty, of national sovereignty on the subcontinent, to the foundational event of the nation, which was, of course, the violence of partition, right? It was ethnic differences that partitioned the nation, but which also brought it into being. So orality is established not as the media of anthropological sadness, but through the element of alterity that inheres in language itself, in the graphic mark of the literary inscription, in the writerly mark, in its difference from the duplicable, copyable human form, and it's linked to the stillness of the elements of the land, offered in their non-human geometry as primal evidence. I can stop here. I have a short conclusion, but may I, what would you like me to do? Okay, thank you. So I think let me just, what I'm suggesting then is that we read Kanwar back through the sort of rough art historical genealogy that I presented through photojournalism, right, from just prior to independence into the 1980s. And I'm suggesting that there is a way in which Kanwar inherits this art historical tradition in a specific way, specific to the experience of the subcontinent, and I think that it's important we retain that awareness in approaching his work. So the Sovereign Forest, I think, is a testimonial in one other aspect, insofar as it inherits a legacy and the possible futures of what was a largely figurative tradition of visual documentary in 20th century India. Let me conclude then by returning to the date 1984, which marked the Union Carbide disaster. Is also the year in which the sovereign nation of India was thrown into crisis following the assassination of the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi by her Sikh bodyguard. An estimated 3,000 Sikhs were killed in the capital of Delhi, Kanwar city and its vicinities, and the state was complicit in either directly or indirectly administering the mass violence. So in both the incident, the Union Carbide incident and the assassination of Indira Gandhi, no perpetrators associated with the state were brought to justice. In an interview with Stephanie Bailey for the journal Ibraz, Kanwar cites this date as the beginning of his interest in the question of sovereign violence as a filmmaker. But read in light of this comment, there's a film called The Prediction, made in 1991, which suggests yet another beginning for the Sovereign Forest. Initiated a decade before it was included into the ensemble, The Prediction comprises physical documents that might be read together as evidence of a peculiar kind of killing, a judicial killing, maybe an extrajudicial killing that had legal backing, but it narrates the death of Shankar Guha Niyogi, the leader of an organized resistance group of the CMMN, of these peoples who were opposing industrial mining in Odisha, by hired killers contracted by leading industrialists. And the courts would acquit these killers of any culpability. Eventually, the Supreme Court would do so too. So foreseeing the failure of nonviolent protest against the law, as well as the catastrophic implications of such failure for organized resistance in the region, Niyogi is said to have predicted his own death. And the episode, as narrated by Kanwar then, cycles between the multiply disavowed memory of the violence of 1984 and a prophetic account of aftermath. There's also present in that work a kind of phantom figure of mass suicide, which was undertaken by rural workers in the decade following Niyogi's death in the face of the loss of their livelihood and food sovereignty. So Indira Gandhi's assassination then is both seized upon and rendered anonymous in this work, such that the spectacular crisis of political murder for Kanwar may not be disentangled from the normalized, aggregated violence of extinction as enacted upon the body and lands of India's working poor. After Kanwar, if we look at this image, I want to say that it may not be an exaggeration to claim that it is the fossil body and not the forest in its deep carbon ground that undergirds the formation of late liberal governmentality in India, even as the modernist dream of sovereignty is reanimated within the fantasy of India as economic world power. To rephrase Elizabeth Pavanelli, insofar as we believe that the fossil was once a form of life, that it lost that life, we also believe that the fossil might emerge again as a form of fuel for a new mode of life, the fully contemporary life of hyper-accelerated, informationalized, and in this sense, probably post-colonial capital. Thank you.
谢谢那个Tania的非常精彩的一个演讲，然后他的用语非常的适宜去处理一个所谓的人类文化地景，其实是一个暴力的一个场景，然后影像本身是一个犯罪现场的记录，就像班雅明所说的一样，摄影其实本身就是犯罪现场的证明。那这样充斥的一个暴力跟地景跟自然，做一个景观，其实这个景观已经成为一种暴力的生态的展示，以及后殖民的一个暴力，刻画了一个整个我们今天当代的一个生活样态哈。那这里也让我们想到非常多的一些当代艺术家对这个问题的处理。其实许光石在下一场可能会谈到，我觉得他曾经在地方计划空间有一个柬埔寨的艺术家叫拉塔，他的地景也是处理了一个所谓的国家暴力的一些议题。那在台湾的当代艺术家里面，我们各位也应该会找到像Tania 所介绍的这位康达，这个非常重要的康沃的这位艺术家的一个创作的参照组，比如说像那个林博义，王博义是王博义是不是？一位艺术家陈博义，抱歉，陈博义啊，他八八风灾的一些摄影里面也看到了一个所谓的大自然的灾害，其实是跟人类本身的开发滥垦的一个议题有关所形成的这些痕迹啊。那我想这些问题应该可以在等一下的中午座谈的时候，如果有的话，有时间的话呢，我想可以得到一些非常有趣的讨论。好，那因为我们时间的限制的关系，我们是到这个3点啊，我们会休息有10分钟，然后我们3点会有下一场的一个报告。好，那我就先在这边做一个简单的一个概述。好，谢谢。